Two-phase commit was a pretty neat thing. Went by pretty quick. Like, you want to spend a little time recapping? Yeah.
So one is homework, 3 is homework, A, and B, when will we get the midterms back?
I am not sure when you're going to get the midterms back. I got him to a grader. He puts in 20 hours a week. I like to have the midterms back. It's never going to be less than a week. And well, I said this last time. Right? It's not going to be less than a week. It's not going to be more than 2. As for homework 3, we want to try to get it up today, but we want it to be perfect, so it might be tomorrow morning.
Awesome.
And by it, I mean spec. The script will trail, but the script will be good. Yeah. I want you to go to office hours. For any time you want to collect a grade or discuss a grade, come to office hours. And I know the office hours have been crowded. We'll figure something out. We'll put a queue in front of you.
What if you can't make it office hours for a lot?
If you can't make office hours at all, writing we'll figure something out. We'll schedule an appointment. If necessary, I can email you your grade. I just prefer to do it face-to-face if possible. So there's always a workaround for everything. Yeah.
Are we going to have 2 weeks for homework 3 or 1 week?
No, the expectation should be 2 weeks, as long as that still leaves 2 weeks for homework 4. Which we're getting close to the wire, we know, and we're on top of it. But yeah, so homework 3 and 4 are roughly of equal difficulty. We change them every year, for obvious reasons, a little bit. This year it's looking like homework 3 may be a little bit more difficult than homework 4, right? And as a consequence, obviously homework 4 is when you've done everything, so obviously that's the most difficult, but there may be a slightly larger chunk of work here, so we may give a tiny bit less time for homework 4 and a tiny bit more time for homework 3. Anything else logistic in nature? No? Excellent. Let's talk about two-phase. Two-phase commit is characterized by 2 sort of roles that computers play. Anybody remember what they are?
Coordinator and
There's
participant.
a coordinator, and there's a collection of participants. Obviously, the problem trivializes if there's just one, right? If there's just one computer, it's easy to do things atomically because you don't partially fail. You just totally fail. It either happens or it doesn't, right? Total failure gives you this awesome version of atomicity, right? Either the computer didn't fail and the good thing happened, or the computer did fail and nothing happened, but you don't need to worry about something having half happen, right? So the commit problem is only an interesting problem if you have a compound piece of work that should appear to be atomic being performed by more than one computer, right? I'm just going to draw a third computer on here just for now, just to make things generalized. And the way that we model this is that a client is going to come to the system with some operation that they want performed, and the client, just like a kind of a primary backup replication, right? It's always going to dispatch the command to the coordinator. Remember, I sort of made this analogy that the coordinator is sort of akin to a minister in a wedding ceremony. Insofar as they're not actually doing any work, they're doing a lot of talking, and they're establishing the contract between the participants. Yeah, I gave a talk many years ago, this was like way back in 2008, in which I was advocating for using this new language that I had made up to program systems, and I was talking about two-phase commit, and I pointed out, that Jim Gray had compared two-phase commit to the wedding protocol. And then I had this kind of cosmic observation where I was like, marriage is both a contract, right? Like 2 people are together in the eyes of God and the state or whatever, exactly if they have agreed to be together forever and it was witnessed by a minister. So that's like a contract. But it's also a protocol, right? In the sense that you have these 2 people in the same place, and the minister says, "Do you take?" And they say, "Yes, I do." And he says, "I now pronounce you." Right? So that's a protocol. That's how you could tell a computer to do. The contract. So in some sense, the wedding contract is like a property. The two-phase commit is like a protocol. And what I argued in this talk was that if you write down two-phase commit in the right language, you kind of get both at once. Or I argued that the contract, 2 people are together in the eyes of the state if they say they want to be in the presence of the minister, implies the protocol. In some sense, there's only one protocol. If this protocol didn't exist, you would have invented it, or something like that. I don't know. And so when I teach Paxos, I'm going to make this kind of crazy argument, and I'm going to try to do it today if we have time, that Paxos wasn't invented, it was discovered. In some sense, this was the inevitable protocol to solve the problem that we're going to look at. And the way I'm going to argue that is we're going to try to implement consensus more simply, right? Because Paxos is like the famous for being the most complicated protocol ever. Nobody understands it. It's really hard to teach, really hard to understand. So I'm going to try to teach it and make you understand it. That's hard. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to like try to do a simpler consensus protocol. In fact, I'm going to try the simplest consensus protocol. It's not going to work. We're going to make it a little more complicated. That's not going to work. Make it a little more complicated. That's not going to work. And then suddenly we're going to add one little more bit of complexity, and it's suddenly going to work. And the takeaway is, wow, like all that complexity was like essential. You take away one tiny bit of the complexity, the thing falls on its face. Okay, so and the reason I brought up this stuff about the contract is like sometimes the protocols feel like they were just out there, you know, waiting to be discovered, because it's the only sensible way to deal with it. Okay, so as we said, the coordinator is going to initiate what's called a prepare phase. Now, typically, the prepare method isn't just a bare prepare. It's going to have some instructions about the work that needs to be done. The work is going to differ depending on the type of system we're implementing. Two-phase commit was implemented in the context of database systems, where the work is to perform a transaction, a bunch of reads and writes to a bunch of different variables all at once, atomically. But the model we're using is, let's imagine we're just moving a file from one computer to another. It's a similar problem. Any problem that is compound that should appear to be atomic can be addressed with two-phase commit. So the prepare phase goes out, and what do the participants do? In primary backup, the participants just write something to their disk and say, right? What's different about this protocol?
They've got some sort of mechanism through which they prepare the commit and then say, okay, I've prepared it.
Yeah.
Or
why do they do that though? Like, why bother? Why not just do primary backup? Like, yeah, it's done. It's done.
So they do this so they do some initial check and then they prepare it, and then if the prepare is successful, then they're able to do it.
Yeah, so critically, it's because the operation that you've asked them to do, they might be unable or unwilling to do it. And what's more, P2 might be willing and able to do it, but P2 doesn't know if P3 is going to do it or not. So P2 had better goddamn well not do it in an irreversible way, speculating that everybody else is going to vote yes, right? So there's two reasons why. The reason that you do two-phase commit is you're not sure if it'll work. For any given participant, you're not sure if they can do it. And every participant is unsure about all the other participants. Like, similar to the two generals problem, right? You're like, you can't really attack because I don't know that you know that I know that you know that, right? Okay, so we're not just gonna, so we're gonna essentially see if we decide if we're willing to do it, test if we're able to do it. And if the answer to both is yes, we're going to reply with a yes, right? And what does the coordinator do?
Send a commit message to all the participants.
Exactly when it has gotten a yes from every participant, we'll put the commit point here. We'll say, like, at this point, the coordinator knows the status of the transaction. He knows about the willingness of all the participants. And now remember, this is a subtle point, but I mentioned yesterday, or Wednesday rather, there's two different ways that you could kind of implement this logic at this point. One would be to say, the coordinator must deterministically vote with the wishes of the participants. That is to say, if the coordinator's gotten all yeses, she must tell them to commit. That's one version, and sometimes you see that version. Why does that version have nice properties? Does anybody remember? There's one reason why that version is awesome. Yeah.
Because if the coordinator crashes for whatever reason, then the protocol can complete.
If the coordinator crashes, and we haven't given the coordinator this right to sort of unilaterally decide at the last minute the commit decision, then it's possible, not necessarily always true, it's possible for the other people to sort of figure out what the commit decision was on their own. But you could see how if we went the other route and said, the coordinator is allowed to, even when they've gotten 3 yes votes, decide no. Right? The example I gave there was, they might do that if the client was like, oh, psych. Like the client said like, Control C, Control C, Control C. And now it's not too late to not have done it. So the coordinator says, nope, abort. That's a nice feature too, to be able to abort on an interrupt, right? But that limits our ability to recover from coordinator failures. That's a design choice, right?
Question?
Yeah.
What can you do both?
What?
What can you do both?
Why
What
can't
can
you
you-
do both?
Like, unless there's a commit message, from
Well, so like, let's say, for
psych
example,
message from client.
let's say, for example, that it was this situation, right? The coordinator decided to abort, and then they crash. So the decision is abort, right? And that means that everybody has to decide abort, right? Because we're implementing an agreement. Right? And so we have all these yeses, but we need the answer to be no, in some sense. Okay.
It's not that way.
Well, and remember, this really matters in real life because the coordinator might like recover from the crash and still believe that the transaction is aborted. And in fact, they might have even told the client that it's aborted or something crazy, right? So now let's say this guy wakes up after a timeout down here and he says, wait a minute, I expected to hear the commit decision by now, and I haven't, so the coordinator must be down. So this person engages in this thing we discussed on Wednesday, but I didn't give a name. It's called CTP, the Collaborative Termination, what? Protocol! and the way it works is, after you get a prepare message from the coordinator, you set a timer. That is the longest you expect to not hear from the coordinator. And when that timer goes off, you send a message broadcast to the other participants and ask them what their commit decision was. And if everybody now, how do you think this protocol works? Okay, so you talk to everybody. Ask everyone their commit decision. And then the logic is obvious, right? So if anyone voted no, then what?
Abort.
Well, it's certainly abort. That's a safe one, right? There's no way any transaction ever commits if one process voted no. So that's cool. If, what?
Anyone fails to respond, vote no.
Seems no.
Well, let's not do that. Let's put that off for last, and I don't think that's safe. Yeah?
If the coordinator doesn't send a message in a timeout, then we're allowed to broadcast it on.
Well, we've already said, wait till you think the coordinator's dead, ask everyone their commit decision. If anyone voted no, there's abort, and then there's one more rule.
If the coordinator
comes back
If everyone voted yes,
If everyone voted yes,
Commit.
what?
then commits.
But that doesn't work if the coordinator was allowed to unilaterally abort. Sorry it took so long to answer your question.
Gotcha,
But
gotcha.
yeah, we would like to be able to say, if everyone voted yes, then commit. Because we're not going to satisfy termination if we don't have if we don't have a way to abort or commit, right? And that works great if the coordinator is not allowed to unilaterally abort, and what else is required to make this work?
No participants crash.
No participants crash. Because if even a single participant crashed, we have no idea what everyone voted. That single participant who crashed, right? So let's imagine we have this happen. Now, the coordinator knows this person's vote. The coordinator's down. Right? If P1 goes out and asks everybody what they voted, and finds out that P2 voted yes, and P1 also voted yes, P1 can't make a move. Because P1 can't tell the difference between the world in which P3 voted yes and the world in which P3 voted no. There's only one person who knows that world, and that person's dead. Those two people who know that world are both dead. Right? Yeah.
So in CTP, does the participant have to be aware of exactly how many other participants are there? Everyone.
Because it has to be able to evaluate.
In that case, if everyone voted yes, doesn't that take care of the case that no one's crashed?
But yeah, right. But so the other possibility is that you're waiting.
You hit the timeout.
But then maybe you say, okay, well, I hit a timeout. Okay, I time out. I've decided that P3 is dead, maybe. But what do? I can't do anything. Right? So, bottom line, if the coordinator crashes, after the prepare phase finishes, if the coordinator crashes early, we can abort. The coordinator crashes after the prepare phase finishes, and one participant crashes. Two-phase commit does not terminate. Locks forever until one or both of these guys come back. Okay?
So at that point, you get into your rollback and reload your backup and somehow restore your system.
Well, no, I mean, typically, so what you have to do, what you have to do is bring this machine back online somehow, even if it means replaying some logs or something like that. Now, usually it's, one of the ways that you mitigate this is you have all the state of record. Like if this is a database, the database is partitioned over the participants, and the participants are sitting on the heavy state. And the coordinator maybe is just sitting on a log of like exactly which operations happened and in which order, right? So there's like less state to recover, precisely because recovery has to be really fast. And now, and you can imagine like in a database system, the effects of this kind of locking can be absolutely catastrophic because there might be all these processes that are like holding locks on data items. So the database is like locked up, can't make any progress until we know whether that particular transaction holding locks committed or aborted. And it might be indefinitely long before we hear back from the coordinator. So a failure of a coordinator happens in practice in database systems, and it can be like the end of your business, you know? And that's what I mean. What do I mean by SPF? I'm not talking about sunscreen. You ever heard the acronym SPF?
Single point of failure.
The single point of failure, right? So we have this idea of nodes playing roles, but arguably a problem with the two-bit commit protocol is that the roles are directly mapped to particular machines, right? Alice might be playing the role of coordinator, Bob might be playing the role of participant 1, Carol might be playing the role of participant 2. And because nodes can crash, the entire role of coordinator can disappear from the earth, and we can become locked up. So as we move over into consensus systems, we're going to start looking at systems in which all of the nodes can play all of the roles. Okay. I think I'm going to do Paxos. Any more questions about 2PC? So 2PC is useful because it solves a hard problem. Atomic, visible atomicity of compound operations in a system in which partial failure can interrupt the operations. Super important. It is a version of the agreement problem that I introduced on Monday, right? Because it involves a collection of machines communicating via messages, machines which may fail, coming to all agree on something. In fact, it's a very heavyweight version of everybody agreeing. It requires unanimous agreement. So it shouldn't surprise you that the failure of any node will make it so we can't make forward progress, and the failure of the coordinator node is particularly catastrophic. Okay. Who remembers what the 3 rules of agreement protocols are? Because it's going to turn out that the 3 rules of consensus too, plus there's another. Yeah.
Validity, termination, and agreement.
Validity, termination, and agreement. You forget, because it's kind of like, duh. Right? Agreement. Right? And remember I said, you know, I guess well, one quick question to ask is, what kind of property is agreement?
All output must be same.
Say again?
All output must be same.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's kind of what it says. It says, if one node produces an output X, then all nodes produce the output X. But what type of property is it? Yeah.
Oh, safety.
It's a safety property. Why do you say that?
Because there's a finite counterexample.
Yeah, because for example, like if I was to say 1, 1, oh, there it is. There's your violation right there. Right? So like I can have a finite X. The very minute that this one poops out an O, we know something went wrong. It's a safety property. Good. What about, so validity says what?
The answer is one of the inputs.
Yeah, so validity, and validity is what kind of property?
Safety.
Because there it is, so there's a validity violation. Because 2 wasn't in any of these inputs, but it came in the output. And termination is what kind of property?
Liveness.
Yeah, because you're never like, see this picture? You know, oh, by the way, it goes on forever. See how it fails to terminate? And it's like, no, I don't see how it fails to terminate. It might terminate right down there below the bottom of the board, right? I don't know. So good. Safety, liveness. And I argued that, broadly speaking, an agreement protocol is only going to be able to satisfy 2 of these, but it's going to make a damn good attempt to satisfy all 3. So in general, you're going to see protocols that promise to satisfy 1 and 2, and like very nearly always satisfy 3, but there's some like pathological cases. Okay? Commit is certainly an example of that, except that this pathological case looks all too common. Right? If the probability that a node fails is P, the probability that you will have a coordinator failure is P, right? We would like to do much better than that. So I'm going to say a consensus protocol we would like. In the past, I've just said is fault tolerant, and in the last office hours before exams, I realized that like fault tolerant is a word that we use colloquially, but a word that we haven't really defined. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more precise. I'm just going to say we don't want there to be a single point of failure like there was in two-phase commit. In general, what we're going to want from consensus is we want consensus to remain available and to terminate as long as a majority of the participating nodes are alive. So it's not only can we tolerate the loss of one, we can tolerate the loss of any minority of the nodes and still make progress without getting locked up. Yeah? Desirable, I think. Okay, so what's so hard about that, right? That doesn't sound that hard. Right? Why have I been, making a boogeyman out of consensus? There are a number of well-known protocols that solve the consensus problem, with the footnote that you can't solve this one. But certainly the most well-known is a protocol called Paxos, developed by, guess who developed Paxos? Boy. One cranky boy. Yeah, so, but more recently there's a protocol developed at Stanford called Raft by Diego Ungaro and John Osterhout. Around the same time that Paxos was being developed, Barbara Liskov at MIT, I think, developed a protocol called Raft. She developed a protocol called U-stamped replication. These are all almost exactly the same protocol if you kind of squint your eyes a little bit. And so there's no point in me teaching you more than one of them. Paxos is the one that I prefer because I cut my teeth on it. So, yeah, that's what we're going to do, guys. Which of these things seems like which of these things seems trickiest to get right?
Third.
You agree that they're all hard. That's fine. They're all hard. I mean, I think validity is easy. Right? It's easy to not just say some shit. It's easy to like say one of the inputs. Right? So I don't think this one's particularly hard to do. We just need it because otherwise it's trivially solvable. I think, well, obviously this one's hard because it's so hard you can't do it. But this is the one that like you need to be really careful. Right? Because an agreement protocol that sometimes fails to agree is kind of not worth anything. Yeah?
Would no SPF be a line property?
Say again?
Would no SPF also be a line property?
Safety.
Well,
I mean, I think it depends. I think like we want, in some sense, it's like a qualifier for the properties, right? We want these properties under the assumption. So no SPF means nodes can crash. Some number of nodes can crash without compromising termination validity or agreement in some sense. So is it a safety property? And it's kind of a constraint. It makes it a little harder to maybe achieve the property. But systems with an SPF are going to run afoul of the blackness property, obviously, right? So that's another way of framing it. Okay, so how might you implement consensus? What would be the simplest way to ensure agreement?
Without validity?
Huh?
Without validity?
Without validity. Okay, what would be the second simplest way to ensure agreement? That's a good answer, absolutely, yeah.
Communicate and choose the majority answer.
Well, I don't think that would be the simplest way. That involves communication and choosing. And I think this. So remember how we got a total order in primary backup?
Arrival.
How?
it's whatever the primary is.
So there was a distinguished node called the primary, and it just decided that the order was the order in which the messages happened to arrive at the primary. So arrival order at a distinguished node. That works if there's just one of those nodes. And it obviously doesn't if there's two, right? Right? Okay, so that seems like a good idea. Why don't we just have, oh, I forgot something. Like in two-phase commit, Paxos is going to split the world up into a collection of roles that computers play. But unlike in two-phase commit, it's not going to statically map the roles to machines. Everybody's going to be able to play all the roles. So the first role is proposers. Okay, proposers, kind of similar to the role of the coordinator in two-phase commit. Their job is to receive requests from clients and to propose values for consensus among the other participating nodes. So they sort of are, they're in charge of disseminating in much the same way that a primary is in primary backup and the coordinator is in two-phase commit. The other critical role is the role of acceptors. And again, this is kind of akin to participants in two-phase commit. Acceptors play a passive role on the network. They accept proposals and vote on them. They say, sure, I'll accept that proposal, or no, I'm not going to accept that proposal. Okay? So they vote like participants. And there's a third role that Lamport defined that I'm not going to cover in this class, but I'm going to name it anyway for the sake of completeness, called listeners. And the idea of listeners is, like the acceptors, they hear about the values that were proposed, and they just remember them. They don't participate in voting. They're sort of passive listeners. Why would you make this distinction? Why wouldn't you have everybody just participate? Why would you have people just listening and not voting? Yeah.
If one of the acceptors goes down, a listener can take over as an acceptor?
Well, maybe, but if I just, like, let's imagine that I had 2 acceptors and 2 listeners. Like, that's true, but I could have just had 4 acceptors, too, right? So, listeners can't just be there to have a few extra acceptors around, because you could just have a few extra acceptors around. Huh? They don't talk to anyone, they just listen. Yeah?
They already deploying information, so they didn't do it.
Well, no, they're kind of learning about the operations at the same rate as the acceptors are. So they haven't done any. So I guess I'll just tell you. So remember how I said in quorum replication, it's really cool to set W to some value less than N, right? Because that means you have lower latency and you can tolerate the loss of some nodes because you declare victory as soon as you hear back from W nodes, right? You don't wait for all of them. So listeners are a way to essentially get more durability, like more people to remember what we decided, so we can survive the loss of all of the acceptors and still not forget what happened, in a way that doesn't actually penalize us or slow down our protocol because the proposer's not waiting for acknowledgments from them, right? So it's a way to extend your fleet of rememberers without having to go as slow as the slowest node in terms of your voting. Does that make sense? It's very much the same argument for why you want to tune your W and your R in quorums. Yeah?
So you said listeners just listen and don't talk anybody, but that means other nodes can perform, like read from listeners, is that right? Or no?
No.
So
No, I mean, somebody could one day read from them, but they don't participate in the protocol called Paxos.
Okay.
They might eventually participate.
Huh?
You might end up participating.
Yeah, or there might be some separate API that you have that's like, hey, what did we decide? But it's sort of outside the scope of the protocol. Right? So like, I could always, like, if everybody went down except for one listener, I could go read the listener's log and figure out what the hell happened. And that would be worth something. And I got that, and sometimes for free, because the listeners didn't actually, there was no penalty for having listeners. And I could add a lot of listeners to a system. In fact, I could add listeners to a system indefinitely until I ran out of bandwidth, with no penalty on the protocol. Okay, but we're not going to study them, because they don't do anything. So there's nothing interesting to study in the context of a protocol. All right. So, now that I've told you about the roles, the simplest imaginable consensus system would be one in which we had a single acceptor, which decides which proposal to accept based on the order in which they arrive. Right? So there might be, imagine, there's a proposer out here, or there's an acceptor, and there's a proposer, and there's maybe a bunch of different clients. So the proposer client sends something to the proposer, and this client sends something to the proposer, and the proposer sends messages to the acceptor. This was, I don't know, x equals 1. This was x equals 2. And it says, I don't know, x equals 1 got there first. So I'm just going to lock into that. And that works great, right? In fact, that looks exactly like this picture. Like this picture is that single acceptor, right? We had x equals 1 and x equals 0. And it was like, I don't know, x equals 1. So we satisfied agreement, trivially, right? Because a node decided 1 and all the nodes decided 1. We satisfied validity because 1 was one of the inputs. And we satisfied termination because it pretty much terminated as soon as it started, right? So that's too good to be true, right? What's wrong with that? So it's a single point of failure, but let's dig in. Like, why is that bad again? Like, what are we afraid might happen?
So what happens if the acceptor dies?
I think there's the obvious thing that what happens if the acceptor dies, we can't make any progress. But there's a more important decision of what happens if the acceptor dies immediately after deciding. So like if the acceptor died before they decided, we knew they hadn't decided, that's no big deal, right? Because we could probably just create another acceptor. The devil's in the details, but you could imagine that you could create another acceptor if you knew that this guy hadn't done anything. But what if he decided and then he crashed? We know that can happen. It happened with the coordinator in two-phase commit. In fact, that's exactly the bad thing that can happen in two-phase commit. Is the coordinator says, I know what the commit decision is, right? So naturally the fear is that because if he's accepted 1 and we spawn up a new acceptor, we're getting really friggin' close to violating agreement too. So yeah, to your point, the single point of failure, we're worried about the violating termination, and that's a drag, but it's an even bigger drag because I don't even think we can ensure number 1 in the case of no failure. Or we can as long as we don't try to spawn another acceptor. We can just say if the acceptor dies, game over. You shall never achieve consensus. Okay, so that didn't work, right? It violates termination, and it might violate agreement too. And I'm going to make a very strong statement here. Single acceptor just doesn't work. Therefore, what? What do we definitely need in this protocol? Multiple acceptors, right? Did somebody say why? Oh, I wish somebody had said why. Because that was kind of inductive. I don't know, because is it the case that because we tried a straw man with a single acceptor and it didn't work, then we must have multiple acceptors? I don't know. I think so, but I don't think it necessarily follows from sound logical reasoning. I don't think that's totally deductive. But I believe it to be true. And it seemed like you all did too, so let's move on. So if we can't have a single acceptor, we must need multiple acceptors, right? Because well, the other possibility is 0 acceptors, or negatively many acceptors, and those don't seem legit, right? So
Yeah, we spent a little while talking about it.
say again?
I was saying we spent a little while talking about and you wouldn't teach one where 0 is an option, right?
Yeah, that would be weird, right? Okay, so we're going to need multiple acceptors, and if we're going to have multiple acceptors, what is a reasonable rule to decide when a value is accepted? Because before we said if there's a single acceptor, it's trivial, right? A value is accepted as soon as the acceptor receives a message, and the value that's accepted is the value of that message. But if we have multiple acceptors, we're going to need a different rule. And I heard it here. If we have multiple acceptors, what would be a good way of deciding when a value is accepted? You said it before.
Communication.
Yeah, communication and maybe a majority rule.
Vote on it, right?
Right? Yeah, because we want there to be one thing accepted. And we remember from quorums that majorities have this really nice property that any 2 majorities are going to intersect. Right? Okay, so multiple acceptors. A value is chosen. We're going to use this terminology in consensus to talk about when something comes out this bottom method. We say it's chosen. A value is chosen if accepted by a majority of acceptors. That makes sense, right? So now the act of accepting a value is not the same as deciding or choosing. right? When we had a single acceptor, accepting and choosing were the same. Now we have this concept of acceptors can accept values, but a value is chosen only if a majority of acceptors accept it. That seems kind of interesting, right? But we still need to decide one more thing, right? So which value do the acceptors accept? Let's start with where we were before and see how it works. So let's say, okay, fine, and they're going to accept the first proposal. Right? That seems reasonable.
What does first mean?
The first proposal they see.
So,
Because every individual acceptor accepts only, there's only one first proposal for every acceptor, right?
But they all might have.
But they all might see different things in different orders. We still got to make. But if we make sure that a majority of them agree, maybe we're okay. What do you think? We okay? Obviously, we're not okay because we're just a few steps into this straw man thing. But let's explain why I say that. Okay. It seems promising, right? It's definitely like we're making progress. This protocol is definitely better than the first one, right? But you know, if I have, let's say, acceptor 1, acceptor 2, 3, 4, 5.
what if there are 5 different proposals?
Yeah, I mean, we can run afoul of that even if there aren't 5 different proposals. We could be like, oh, by the way, everybody's a proposer and an acceptor, right? Like I said.
Oh man.
So we can get into a situation in which these 2 accept x equals 1, and these 2 accept x equals 2, and this one accepts, I don't know, x equals 3, and we don't have a majority, we have a split vote, and because we said the acceptors have to accept the first proposal that they see, they're all locked in. They're locked in, they can't make progress. Right? So this might be a rare scenario, it might work a lot, but in the fullness of time, this is going to happen, and you're going to get locked, you're deadlocked, basically. So that's not going to work, because that like totally violates termination, right? Do we buy that? Am I going too slow or too fast? Just right?
Where's the deadlock again?
Well, so remember we said, when we had our straw man, we said one acceptor is no good because they die after deciding. So we're going to need multiple acceptors. If we need multiple acceptors, the same way to do it is to use majority. And I think that's right. I like that. I'm not going to change that. But then we also have to say, how do the acceptors know what to choose? Right? So, okay, one version of that could be they choose the first thing they see. But you see here that if acceptors always choose the first thing they see, 2 acceptors could choose one thing, 2 acceptors could choose another thing, the 3rd acceptor could choose a 3rd thing, and there is no majority. There's no thing that was chosen by 3. And there's no way to back out of this. Yeah.
How do they accept or decide which values they should vote on to limit that?
Well, we haven't said anything about voting yet, right? We're just doing a straw man. So straw man with single acceptor accepts the thing. Second thing is you send it to multiple acceptors, and it's chosen, and they're just accepting it or not. So we haven't even talked about them acknowledging. And chosen would just be like, oh,
Like I was thinking, you know, if they could only vote between 2 values, then maybe that would be solved, but how do we make sure they only vote between 2 possible values?
well, you know, remember, we don't want to make any assumptions about the input values. The input values could be anything, right? So I think, that's actually an interesting point to bring up. Consensus, does consensus trivialize if there's just, no, because the FLP result was proven when they were just choosing between 0 and 1. So I think the mental question I was asking was like, is consensus fundamentally easier if we restrict our domain? I think the answer is no, actually. But it's a good question to ask. So, but all I'm saying is, you know, we haven't even sketched out the protocol. We're just defining what it means for a value